Right, so welcome again, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this new webinar, MISRA Deviation Permits, Giant Time, and Money Savers. As usual, this is Lavinia, your host, and our speaker is Roberto Bagnara, who is CTO and Chief Scientist at BUGSENG, other than a member of the MISRA C and the WG14 working groups. BUGSENG is the creator of the Eclair static analysis platform, which allows almost complete automation of the checks for MISRA compliance. I see that just as last time, today we have many attendees from the automotive sector. So you'd be interested to know that Eclair is also qualifiable for the main functional safety standards, including, of course, ISO 26262. Speaking of which, make sure you don't miss next webinar, which is verifying the hierarchical structure and freedom from interference of software components. And this will be on November 17th. Just a quick note before we start. Please write your questions in the Q&A section throughout the entire webinar. So at the end, we can read them and reply straight away. All right, then let's turn this over to Roberto.
Okay, thanks, Lavinia. Welcome everybody to this webinar about deviation permits, which this is a very important topic that is not well known as other topics concerning MISRA compliance. So first, a disclaimer, I am a member of the MISRA C working group. However, the views I expressed in this presentation are mine and not necessarily should be taken to represent the views of the working group. And moreover, this is particularly important. The disclaimer is pretty standard if you have followed our series of webinars. In this case, it is even more important because what to deviate and how to deviate is something that is project dependent and requires careful balancing of different and sometimes competing objectives. So you cannot take what I will say as a blanket permission of deviate some rules or doing things. So you have to do things in the precise context of your specific projects. Okay, here is the outline. I will go through some introduction to the topic. I will give a quick recap on deviations because deviation permits, of course, have a lot to do with the deviation process. And then I will introduce deviation permits. What's in a deviation permit? Some example of deviation permits, and I will touch on the topic of permits for adopted code. And at the end, I will draw some conclusion. So let us start giving some context. So this webinar, of course, builds upon and is complementary to other webinars we have already given. And in particular, it assumes that you know something about MISRA C and its role in the compliance to industrial safety standards, what it means for a project to be MISRA compliant, what is the deviation process, and under what conditions some code can be considered adopted. So, for example, legacy and third-party code. So I have tried to make this webinar self-contained, but if you feel you have missing bits, you can find all the webinars on our YouTube channel, and the suggestion is to subscribe not to miss future editions because the channel is populated by other material other than the webinar recordings. Okay, so the document, the reference document for what I'm saying today is called MISRA Compliance 2020. It's an official MISRA document that defines what must be covered when making a proper claim of MISRA compliance. This document is applicable to all revisions of MISRA C 2012 and to MISRA C++ 2008. For the time being, it is optional, the adoption of MISRA Compliance 2020, but it will become mandatory for the next editions of both MISRA C and MISRA C++. And there are concrete advantages in adopting it now. And in particular, Chapter 6 of MISRA Compliance 2020 deals with adopted code. You can download the document from the link I'm giving here. Don't worry, in the post-webinar mailing, you will receive the link, so it's not necessary for you to write it down yourself. Okay, so the development contract, the highest payoff from the adoption of the MISRA guideline is when this is done at the outset of a project, at the very beginning. And this usually arises in the context of a contract between two entities: the acquirer, so the organization commissioning the project, maybe an OEM, and the supplier, the organization developing the code, maybe a tier 1 or tier 2 supplier. And both need to cooperate in the task of assuring compliance with the MISRA guidelines. And it is much, much better if before the project begins, they negotiate all what is negotiable in MISRA compliance. Okay, and applicable MISRA permits are a key element of this negotiation. Okay, so take this into account. There is an acquirer, there is a supplier, and they may agree upon permits to simplify their life and to avoid nasty surprises during the development of the project. So now let's start with the poll. What did you know about MISRA permits before this webinar? Maybe you know nothing about them, or you know that they exist, but no more than that. Or you have seen some MISRA permits, or you may even not only just seen them, but you have approved some of them, or you may have even create some MISRA permits.
Okay, Roberto, so the 23% says nothing, 33% that they exist, but no more than that. 33% I had the opportunity to examine some MISRA permits. Equal 5% I have approved but not created MISRA permits, and I have created and possibly approved MISRA permits.
Okay, very good. This is interesting. This is interesting because it gives me an idea about the audience and allow me to steer the presentation to maximize its utility. Okay, so deviations are very important. They are an inherent part of the MISRA process, and the deviation process in particular is the procedure by which justifiable non-compliances can be authorized and recorded. The exact process is not imposed by MISRA Compliance 2020, the document I was referring to before, because the method may vary between organizations. However, MISRA Compliance 2020 does impose constraint on the process. For more information, you can see the webinar, MISRA Coding Standards and the Art of Deviation. So deviation in particular mean a different thing from what many believe. So many believe that, okay, if you don't want to comply with the guideline, they can simply say, I don't comply. Well, no. So the MISRA Compliance 2020 document is very clear, in fact, that the deviations must not be permitted simply to satisfy the convenience of the developer, or when a reasonable alternative exists that would make the violation unnecessary, or without considering the wider consequences of a particular violation on other guidelines, because guidelines are tied to one another. So deviating one may diminish the protection given by another guideline, or without the support of a suitable process, or without the consent of a designated technical authority. And in particular, the MISRA Compliance 2020 document explains quite clearly that there are only 4 legitimate reasons to justify a deviation. 1 is code quality, 2 is access to hardware, 3 is adopted code integration, and 4 is non-compliant adopted code. There are no other legitimate justifications for a deviation. Okay? So, because of this, a deviation report requires significant work and requires some trained staff, because you basically have to describe the exact circumstances in which you are deviating a guideline. You have to explain why you are deviating. You have to analyze the potential consequences of the deviation. Okay, so this is significant work. And in fact, one of the things that you should always take into account is that very often complying is cheaper than deviating. So the amount of work involved in compliance very often is less than what you need to do a proper deviation. And for this reason, MISRA has provisions to capture common use cases in deviation permits. Okay, the deviation permits provide much of the information that you need to write down in a deviation record. It defines a specific use case under which the violation may be justified, and it specifies the documentation and the process requirements that you have to supply in the deviation record. Okay, so by using deviation permits, the supplier can focus better on the generation of new deviation, because for the deviations that have already been analyzed, the supplier may apply the deviation permits. So deviation permits allow to reduce disruption during the development process, because you have planned the deviation that you want to make and captured them in suitable permits. It will reduce the effort needed to create and review deviation, and this is very important, you can agree with the acquirer beforehand about the permits you are going to apply. Okay. Permits may originate from various sources. So there are official MISRA publications. For example, a set of permits have been developed and published by the MISRA consortium several years ago about MISRA C 2004. The MISRA C working group to which I belong has worked on analogous MISRA C 2012 permits, which are basically finished, and they will be published very soon now. The acquirer may already have approved permits. Okay, this is in the best interest of everyone. So, as I said, the acquirer and supplier are supposed to cooperate in ensuring MISRA compliance. So, it is very good if the acquirer has already, over the years, prepared a set of permits that is prepared to accept, so to simplify the work with the supplier. The supplier may already have developed in-house permits, and the supplier can propose such permits to the acquirers. And you in the audience, you may develop deviation permits. You just need some MISRA training to do this, and when at the end of this webinar, you will see that it's not rocket science. It's something that anyone suitably trained can do. Okay, so what's in a deviation permit? So let me first, before explaining what is in the deviation permit, how do we distinguish a good deviation permit from one that is not so good? So it is good if it is likely to be accepted by the person who has, or organization who is supposed to accept it. And it is good if it is likely to be reused. So the time investment spent in developing a permit, if the work has been properly done, you will be able to reuse this over and over again over multiple projects. And in this sense, permits are a giant time and money savers. Okay, so MISRA Compliance 2020 does not put stringent constraints on the form of deviation permits, but it gives an example of a properly written deviation permit, which we'll now examine. So the contents of a deviation permit, if it is properly done, will contain the following. First, the ID and headline of the guideline to be deviated. So which guideline do we want to deviate? Second, a unique ID for the permit. So ideally, we will want to use the permit many, many times. So we need to identify it in a precise, unambiguous way. Third, the use case, so a short description of the conditions under which violation of the guideline may be supported by the deviation permit. Four, the justification, which is one or more of the four legitimate reasons for deviation we have already introduced. Okay. Well, fifth point, background information that gives more information about the use case and the justification. And six, requirements that have to be fulfilled in order to use the deviation permit to support the deviation. This is the example that is contained in MISRA Compliance 2020. This is a picture taken from that PDF document that you can freely download at the address that we will provide to you in the post-webinar mailing. So as you can see at the top, we have the ID of the rule and the headline of the rule. Then we have a unique identifier for this permit. And below we have the use case. Okay, so the rule says the value of a composite expression shall not be assigned to an object with wider essential type. So some of you will know that this rule is there because some developers might be confused about the type that is used to perform the operations in the composite expression. Okay. And the use case considered in this permit is that the value of a composite expression is assigned to an object of a wider essential type, so there is a violation, in order to avoid suboptimal compiler code generation. So the reason is code quality, and in particular, the time behavior of attribute for the code quality. Then there is background information, so I'm not going to go through it in detail. Basically, there is a reference to a certain compiler that produces inefficient, slow code when you comply with the rule in expression having to do with certain multiplications and so on. Okay. So this is a continuation. Here we have the final part of the background section, and there are several requirements. So about the fact that you are using this only to prevent this suboptimal code generation from that compiler. So let us examine the elements of this deviation permit one by one. So the first is the ID and headline of the guideline to be deviated. So better to be precise, in this example, which is taken from MISRA Compliance 2020, I've been particularly precise, and I will encourage you to do the same. So now, when you say MISRA C 2012, you might refer to the original edition, the one of 2013, or to revision 1, the one of which is much recent. So in this case, I have been precise. MISRA C 2012, revision 1, and the rule is 10.6, and this is the headline. So this was easy. Now, the unique ID for the permit. The suggestion given in MISRA Compliance 2020 is to use such a scheme. Of course, you may choose the different schemes. It's not a strong requirement. It's just a suggestion. But let us go through it. So permit, it says this is a permit. Okay. Source is the source of the permit. So it may be MISRA when it is a MISRA consortium that has written this permit, or maybe BUGSENG. We do write permits, or your company name or acronym instead of source. Okay. Then which MISRA guidelines? This is a shorthand for MISRA C 2012 revision 1, but it could be something denoting, for example, MISRA C++ 2008 or other versions of the MISRA guidelines. Then an ambiguous identification of the particular guidelines within this. Okay, so R10.6 means, of course, rule 10.6. And then for this very rule, we may have several permits. We may have any number of permits, and we may, for example, identify them with letters. So A, B, C, D. In this case, it's A in the example. And as everything we do, we can improve. So we may have already published a certain version of this A permit, and we may want to improve it. So in order to avoid confusion, we may have a final field that identifies the particular version of this permit. Okay. Use case, in the example in MISRA Compliance 2020, the use case is this short sentence explaining that the point is suboptimal compiler code generation. So the justification given in example is code quality. So a reminder, the justification must be one of the four that we have been illustrating before. So code quality, access to hardware, adopted code integration, non-compliant adopted code. So in this case, it is code quality. And this may further qualified by, for example, one of the commonly recognized attributes of code quality. So here we have time behavior, but we could have had portability, maintainability, readability, testability, okay, reusability. Okay, and the background information is the long explanation of the fact that this compiler produces inefficient code when compiling multiplication operations that comply to the rule, and so this is the reason why we want to apply this permit. And the requirements is the list of conditions upon which the permit is applicable. Okay, so in MISRA Compliance 2020, it is shown. So this picture is taken from there, and it shows how, by explicitly referring to the permit, you can simplify a deviation record a lot. So you just put a reference to the permit, and the rest is basically done. Okay, so you don't have to put all the details in the deviation record. So deviation record becomes basically a reference to the permit with some repeated information, so that the people doing the review of the deviation records will have an easier life, not having to go to the permit, for example, to recall what the rule is about or what is the use case. Okay. So let me now present some other examples. Examples I prepared, taken either from our experience in the consulting services that we provide, which includes the development of permits for various customers. So here I am presenting a permit for MISRA C 2012 Revision 1 Rule 20.1, saying that include directives should only be preceded by preprocessor directives or comments. The unique ID given to this permit is permit. The source is BUGSENG. This is the set of coding guidelines. This is the particular guideline inside this, and it is the first permit that we defined on this rule, and it is the first version. The use case is memory mapping header files within code that is mandated by AutoSAR, by a certain clause of AutoSAR. So basically, AutoSAR prescribes a certain format for implementation files, and the memory mapping header files inclusion comes at a certain point, which may be preceded by code or declarations or definitions, which would be a violation of this rule. The justification is code quality, and the attribute of code quality is compliance to standard. So In this case, we want to comply to these AUTOSAR prescriptions. Okay, this is the background information. Okay, so a longer explanation of what the point is. Now I have shortened it in the real thing. Here we would have a precise reference to the AUTOSAR documentation and so on. And as a requirements, we only have one requirement. The includer header file is a memory mapping header file that is included as prescribed by this specification of AUTOSAR. Okay, so it's easy. We do it once and for all, and typically this rule will be violated by in many places in our project, and we simply refer to this permit. Okay, this permit, of course, must be agreed upon with the relevant authorities. So this permit has been developed by BUGSENG. It's not been developed by AUTOSAR, even though there is nothing preventing AUTOSAR from developing their own permits, and you should negotiate this permit with whoever is going to approve your code and the MISRA compliance statement that you will provide to your acquirer. Okay, here we have another example. This time it's rule 14.3 of MISRA C 2012 revision 1. Controlling expression shall not be invariant. The ID is basically as before, simply now this has changed. I've also made the assumption that this is the first permit we have for this rule, and it is the first version of this permit. The use case is, of course, that the result of a controlling expression is invariant in a particular build configuration. So this is something that happens when you have code that is used in a product line. You have many configurations to be built, and in some of them, okay, some controlling expression may be invariant, but they may not be invariant in other configurations. Okay, here the justification is again code quality and in particular reusability. Okay, in the background field, we have more information. So invariant controlling expressions are often used when software is designed to be built under different configuration for a product line. For example, a controlling expression that is always true in a particular configuration may evaluate to false in a different build. And when developing source code, which is to be configured in different ways, it may be preferable to tolerate some controlling expressions that are invariants in a particular build configuration in order to make the code easier to reuse, understand, and maintain. Okay, there is one requirement, and the reason for the invariant controlling expression shall be justified and documented. So we need to write down the fact that there are other configurations in which this controlling expression is not invariant. Okay, so let us touch on the topic of adopted code. So adopted code is a very potential generous source of permits. So let me recall one of the important things that we have covered in the webinar about legacy and third-party code. So the bottom line is that it makes sense to consider some code adopted if it is existing code with a proven track record, if it has been assessed to be fit for purpose, and if the risks involved in changing it outweigh the risk of leaving it as it is. So we don't want to change it, okay? The implications are that the code works as intended. Very importantly, we need not understand its implementation, just the interface, and we will not change it in ways that can impact its integrity. And this is good rationale for permits, okay? And it is in particular good rationale for permits concerning all the guidelines, and there are several of them in MISRA C 2012 and also in MISRA C++, that have only to do with code readability, understandability, and maintainability. Here we have a small selection. Rule 5.3, an identifier declared in an inner scope shall not hide an identifier declared in an outer scope. Why? Because the programmer might be confused by the fact that the same name is reused and one of the names is hiding the other instance. The developers or quality assurance people may be confused about which occurrence is referring what. Okay. Rule 7.1, octal constant shall not be used. This is because octal constants are basically obsolescent. Many programmers have seen only very few octal constants, and as a result, several of them do not know the precise rules that the C language adopts for octal constants. Rule 7.2, a lowercase u or uppercase u suffix shall be applied to all integer constants that are represented in an unsigned type. So the type of integer literals depends on quite complex on a quite complex set of conditions in C, and so a constant may be unsigned implicitly. So the requirement for this u suffix to the programmer is so that the programmer can express that he or she is aware of the fact that this integer literal is unsigned. Rule 7.3, very easy. The lowercase character L shall not be used in a literal suffix. Why? Because it can be easily confused for the digit 1. Okay. And there are many other rules of this kind that are meant to prevent developers' confusion, but as adopted code is not meant to be read, reviewed, or modified by human programmers, these concerns do not apply, and we can easily develop permits for them. Okay. Notice that we are assuming adopted code in the precise sense I have explained it before. So the code works as intended. So this is clear. Okay. For instance, if this adopted code is automatically generated code, there are several kinds of code that you may consider as adopted, and automatically generated code is one of these possibilities. We assume that the code generator has been suitably qualified. Okay, so we start from the assumption that the code generated by the automatic code generator is correct. So under this assumption, we can develop a permit for, I've taken the simplest example, so for rule 7.3, saying that the lowercase character L shall not be used in a literal suffix. Okay, permit, BUGSENG, MISRA C 2012 revision 1, rule 7.3, permit A, version 1 of this permit. The use case is that in adopted code, the lowercase L is used in a literal suffix. The justification in this case is the third one in the list, if I remember correctly, the third of the fourth, non-compliant adopted code. This is one of the 4 legitimate reasons for deviating. The background is simple. In adopted code that is not meant to be read, reviewed, or modified by human programmers, no developer may be confused by the potential ambiguity between the digit 1 and the letter L. Okay? The requirement is that this permit can only be applied to adopted code that is not meant to be read, reviewed, or modified by human programmers. Okay? And in a very similar way, you can have permits for all the other MISRA rules that only have to do with developer confusion, with possible developer confusion. So it's time for the poll number 2. What do you think of MISRA permits now?
There you go.
So maybe you don't like the concept, or maybe you like the concept, but you think that they don't fit your work environment. And if this is the case, we would like to know more. So, or maybe you think they are great, but you believe you might have problems in convincing your management to embrace them, or you believe they are great and you see no problem why your organization should not just adopt them.
Okay, so 11%, I don't like the concept. 10%, I do like the concept, but I think they don't fit my work environment. 15%, I think they are great. The problem is convincing management to embrace them. 52%, so the majority, I think they are great and can be introduced in my organization. And 14%, we already use them and we will keep doing so.
Very good, very good. Okay, so it's time to go towards the conclusion. So let me stress the following point. So the title of the webinar is that permits basically can save a lot of time and money. So let me explain you again why. Because they capture common use case and make proper deviation very simple. So when you have captured your use case, of course, one of the problems that I may imagine people who responded that they have to convince management this may be problematic. Of course, you have to do some investment, but if MISRA compliance is an integral part of your job, meaning that more often than not, you develop projects that are supposed to be MISRA compliant, then the effort spent in preparing MISRA permits will be repaid many, many times. Okay? So another very important advantage that they can be negotiated at the outset of the project between the acquirer and the supplier. And this very, very often, it allows preventing project delays, penalties, or even litigations. Okay, so too often, in my humble opinion, the requirement of MISRA compliance is not spelled out with enough precision in a development contract, and this is a recipe for trouble, because in the end, someone will claim MISRA compliance, and who has to recognize it will have a different opinion about what MISRA compliance is. And deviations are one of the main troublemakers. So if you can agree on permits beforehand, this will be much better. And the chances that your project will go to completion smoothly and will be accepted at the end, and you will need not reworking it because of deviations that have not been accepted. So it's much better. As I said, many of the permits you will develop can be reused over different projects. And another thing I didn't talk about, Eclair, this talk, but with a tool like Eclair, they can be efficiently implemented. What is the point of efficiently implementing the permit? It's basically automatizing the verification of the requirements. You remember? The final part of the deviation permit is a requirement. So here, two of the examples I have made are captured into an Eclair configuration. Let me go through it very quickly. So I am tagging all the files that are under the directory called automatically generate code dir, all the files. I am assigning to them the tag AGC. It's short for automatically generated code. Okay. Then, do you remember the rule 7.3, the one about using the lowercase l suffix in an integer literal? So in the documentation, which Eclair will insert in the final report, I simply reference the permit. I am applying the permit BUGSENG, this one, this, and this. And consequently, I am allowed to hide all the violation of this rule in an area of code which is tagged with the tag AGC. So I'm only deviating this rule in automatically generated code, which is what the requirement prescribes. Actually, my requirement was a bit more liberal. It says any adopted code. Okay? But I can use different tags, so adopted code, and make automatically generated code part of the adopted code, third-party code, another part of the adopted code, and so on. So you get the idea. The other example is the memory mapping header files prescribed by AutoSAR. Here I am assuming the simple case where the memory mapping header file is called memmap.h. Okay, and I invoke this permit and I say that I am deviating exactly this rule for header files whose name is memmap.h, okay, which is what the constraint asked me to do. So now it's really time to conclude. We have addressed the topic of MISRA permits. There are several messages to take home. Permits are giant time and money savers. We recommend them their adoption in the maximum possible way. With proper tool support, MISRA permits can be easily applied, and with suitable MISRA training, permits can be developed and used by anyone, including you. Okay? The MISRA C working group will soon publish a set of permits applicable to MISRA C 2012. However, I don't want this point 4 to diminish the effect of point 3. You can develop your own permits. You need not wait for official one. Of course, when the official one will be published, you will have a certain set of permits that will be directly usable, and the chances that someone will not accept them are very little. But you can develop your own permits. So whether you are, fifth point and last point, whether you are a software supplier or acquirer, we provide consulting services that, among other things, may assist you in the development of permits that will make your life simpler. And in particular, we may help you develop permits and the corresponding Eclair configuration so that the requirements of the permit can be automatically checked. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say for today. If you have questions, I will be happy to try answering.
Thank you, Roberto. So we have a lot of questions, so let's get ahead with it. So please let us know, from when is the MISRA Compliance 2020 officially applicable?
So MISRA Compliance 2020 is applicable for MISRA C 2012 and MISRA C++ 2008, and from the date of publication is applicable. So MISRA Compliance 2020, from the day it was published, which is a few months ago, is applicable to all MISRA C 2012 and MISRA C++ 2008 projects.
Okay. Will MISRA Compliance 2020 become mandatory for MISRA C 2012 also? If yes, any ballpark time frame?
No, it will not be mandatory. So the next edition of MISRA C will be MISRA C 2020 something. Nobody knows when. So we are working on it, but you know, this takes time. And it will be become mandatory at that time. So likely we will have a new edition of MISRA C++ before the next edition of MISRA C, and for the new edition of MISRA C++, the MISRA compliance 2020 document will become mandatory. And it will become mandatory for a very simple reason. Some of the material that is now contained into MISRA C 2012 and MISRA C++ has been taken out for the next version. So this material, which is common, which is about the definition of compliance, has been factored out, and so it will not be contained in the coding standards themselves.
Okay, so next question. Can we have a single approved deviation permit file for a project listing the details of all the rules permitted to be deviated in that project?
I am not sure I understand this question, so...
if you want to reread it, it's in the Q&A section. It's a long one. You may need...
So a permit is a different thing. So permits are rule-specific, okay? I think maybe you are referring to the guideline recategorization plan, okay, where you can, under certain conditions, recategorize guidelines, for example, from required to mandatory, or from advisory to required or mandatory. And in particular, you can disapply some advisory guidelines by giving a rationale for this. So I suggest you look at the webinar where we have addressed compliance explicitly.
All right. I have a question about EL character. I think you cannot use a variable with the one as a suffix.
So I think there is a misunderstanding here. One thing is that the rule concerns integer literals. Okay, so for example, if you specify the integer literal in decimal base 2, if you write 2, the type is int. If you follow the 2 by n, either lowercase or uppercase, the type of the literal becomes long. Okay, and so this is what the rule talks about. Concerning variables, I don't see what is the problem of calling a variable A1. I think that, but I mean, this has nothing to do with the rule 7.3.
All right, next question is a funny one. Which tools to facilitate the automation of the use of documented deviation would you recommend? Hold on a second. Would you recommend, for example, quick search, traceability, etc.?
Well, short answer is Eclair. So I would recommend Eclair. I think that Eclair is all what you now. I didn't want to complicate the presentation, but the implementation of permits, which I've shown, can be parametric. So you can, in the Eclair configuration language, define a function which has the same name of a permit, for example, and this function may have parameters. So you can easily apply parameterized permits in the Eclair configuration.
Okay. When will the MISRA C 2012 permits by MISRA be published?
So I'm not allowed to answer this question. So I think I can safely say that the document has been closed and it is in the hands of the publisher. So it's just the time to put all the required stamps and publish it on the MISRA website.
All right. Does Eclair allow defining parametric permits? I think you said that before.
Yes. You can define parametric permits essentially by using functions. you can define a function that corresponds to a permit, and this function may add parameters, and the parameters may contain, I don't know, file names or identifier names or similar things.
Okay, Roberto, we have another question, but it's not clear, so perhaps we will ask for clarification by email. And if you agree, I will conclude now.
Okay.
All right. So thank you, Roberto, and special thanks to all of you for being with us today. Of course, clearly, if you have more questions, you can always drop us an email at info@bugseng.com. If you want to have a chat about your projects, and more specifically, if you need to comply with MISRA, our team will be more than happy to guide you through it and provide you with highly specialized training, qualification, and consulting services. Also, if you think that Eclair could be a good fit for your company and perhaps you'd like to give it a try first, we can arrange a free trial. All you have to do is head over to bugseng.com/eclair/free trial and fill a quick small form. Hold on just a second and let me invite you to attend Embedded TestCon 2020, which is a virtual conference organized by Menlo Park Technologies from November 3rd to November 6th. Our team will participate with a technical session, a workshop, a case study presentation, and will also take part in a panel discussion. The full schedule, all registration links, etc. are on etestcon.com, so make sure you book your place. All right, so until next webinar, we hope to hear from you very, very soon and see you next time. Have a nice day, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.